Behold, my glorious supporter, EyePatchNotes, has requested some discussion about Buildcraft as Bus Schedules Edition. For September, we can analyze the implementation of bus schedules in the famous tabletop game Grungy Inns and Gorgons. 3.5 plus 1.5, do not split the party. This parlay is about how some games, a lot of games, make you make a build with kind of limited time or an amount of decision points, a pretty limited amount of those. And so delaying when you make that decision point is meaningful because these games generally have you playing the build at every stage of development rather than only at completion. Let me briefly give you two examples to help illustrate this is for what we're talking about. So in Warframe, for example, you can not very easily not play a build really until it's done. You could do things that are only for, leveling to level up your Warframe and essentially not play it until, in a mission where you would be using the build to its fullest extent until it's complete. You don't need to partially mod your weapons, really. You can just level them up while you're using something else, or that weapon if you have a high mastery rank. And then only when it's complete do you bring it into, an actual context. There are other games like Hades and Dungeons and Dragons, which is what we're actually talking about today, D&D 5th edition, Grungy Inns and Gorgons, where you play the build, you have to play the build at least most points until its completion. There are a few wrenches, of course. A lot of people play D&D campaigns that don't start at first level or that actually don't level up, maybe a one-shot. But the default way to play the game is that you will be playing your build at least several stages of its completeness. Right? Maybe not all of them, maybe not from 1 to 20, that's uncommon, sure. But 1 to 7 or 1 to 10 or 4 to 15 or something, who knows how long your individual campaigns are, but you get the point. That's kind of how the game is structured. We'll talk about that more if you're not familiar with that. And in Hades, you do, play your build from when you have no boons till the end. Now, you can in Hades temporarily focus on a different part of your build, your special versus your attack or your cast for a little bit, maybe because a chaos boon punishes you for using one or the other, something like that. Sure, that happens, but only briefly. It's generally not possible, unless the run is trivially easy to do that for a long time. So you see the difference. You aren't making something, finishing it, and then sending it out there. These are games where making your build is sort of the game, kind of. You're progressing your character's story, or the run is getting spicier as you get up to the top of hell. That kind of thing. So that's what we're talking about, basically, how those schedules can be really interesting build opportunities. Specifically, we're going to move on to talk about how characters in Grungy Inns and Gorgons, Dungeons and Dragons, tend to fall into various categories depending on when they get notable design features, things that Dungeons and Dragons is designed around you getting at a specific time, and how you can use multiclassing or various subclasses or ability combos to get those things maybe earlier and thus upset the balance, which can be really exciting. Before we do that, though, I want to talk about something that EyePatchNotes also wants to talk about, a kind of a gripe with the word level. Here, EyePatchNotes says, when a 5th level sorcerer casts a 3rd level spell, the exact meaning of level becomes muddy. That's putting it lightly. What is a level? A miserable pile of class features. But enough talk. Have at you. EyePatchNotes proposes using hours instead, which helps reframe the game as timed buses. This bus metaphor gets me every time, man. Yeah, totally. So some examples: a 3 o'clock wizard with access to 2nd level spells, a 5 o'clock fighter with access to extra attack. It's certainly clearer. It is certainly less difficult to understand what is meant. So for the rest of this parlay, o'clock means level. 20 o'clock. What are you gonna do? Anyway, 12 o'clock, right? 13 o'clock. We won't get there. We're mostly focusing on 1 through 5 here, but yeah. So we'll use that from here on out. I do have some things to say about the use of, the overuse for sure of the word level in Dungeons and Dragons, at least in 5th edition. The amount of different things. Okay, to be fair, especially if you multiclassing does make this worse, and that's, like, I guess our fault as the players. And if you're multiclassing, you're probably comfortable enough with that it's fine, I guess, whatever. But I still feel like that's your cantrips and your proficiency bonus and your levels in each individual class and what level spells you have access to. It's just confusing, and each individual class's level of spells they have access to is just a little more confusing than is necessary if they just reworded things a little, I think, but whatever. Anyway, so again, to the topic at hand, we're going to talk about, well, EyePatchNotes says, for the purposes of this parlay, I'd like to hone in on what it means to be a pure character. A 5 o'clock fighter, for example, can peruse everything on their class page and feature list. Their output is measured. You know what they're going to be able to do. They can essentially do the fighter things. The same can be said about other weapon-based characters like the Barbarian and Monk. However, the real buildcraft to you, certainly to me, is reproducing a specific mechanic at a higher or lower cost. So let's talk about extra attack. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, the game is designed around enemies being a certain difficulty to hit for a given level, and they're meant to scale with your player level. They've done a lot of math in the back end to make it so if you are given enemies of the appropriate challenge rating, the appropriate level, for your level, or what hour of the night it is, as it were, what point in your bus schedule you're at, then the enemies will always have about a 35% chance to not get hit. You have about a 65% chance to hit them on average. Obviously, what race you pick and exactly how high your attacking stat is at the beginning of your time playing, that will vary, and what you use your 4 o'clock ability score improvement or feat for, that all makes a difference. But at 5 o'clock, all these martial classes, these physical weapon classes, get extra attack. They get to attack twice when they take the attack action instead of once. And indeed, as EyePatchNotes has helpfully included here, there is kind of a design philosophy to Dungeons & Dragons classes overall, and we're going to read it now. If you're not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons and this sounds interesting to you, something kind of like what Hades is doing in some ways, then this might help you ground it a little bit. So, EyePatchNotes says, given all the character classes in Grungians and Gorgons, we can find this simplified design trend. At 1 o'clock, you generally get your identity. You get proficiencies, that is like what stuff your character is good at using or can use without being unable to cast spells. You get your restrictions, like your flavor stuff. Monks are already being offered some bonuses if they don't use certain types of things, if they don't use a shield, if they don't use heavier weapons, if they only use monk weapons or their fists. Even at first level, monks are already being offered advantages if they do that. That's not exactly a restriction, but I know exactly what you mean. If you have spellcasting at level 1, your spellcasting focus, or like artificers have to use a spellcasting focus for every spell they cast, so they have that restriction right away, I guess. Or if you multiclass into artificer. Druids generally don't wear metal armor. This one has kind of faded away. In 5th edition, you can wear metal armor as a druid. Personally, I never felt this made much sense. It's like, ore is natural. I don't know. Like, metal is not that unnatural, in my humble opinion. Many cultures worldwide disagree on this. There are many where it is and many where it isn't. Metal is even a primary element in some traditions, but sometimes it isn't. But certainly it is a druid thing to have a relatively natural accoutrement, and obviously that applies as much as it ever does at first level. Sure, that's a good example. Barbarians and monks also have unarmored defense. It sometimes doesn't make sense to use that at first level, but if they don't wear any clothes, well, you can wear clothes, but if they don't wear any armor, they get, an increase to their armor class if their stats are, depending on what their stats are. So flavor overall, you get one level in the class and that's kind of defined. A really interesting thing I want to note about this kind of 1 o'clock point Since this is actually mostly going to be me talking, I'll take this away. Sometimes I use that little banner as a way to indicate when I'm talking versus EyePatchNotes, but there's going to be a lot to say in this parlay, so we should probably get comfortable. One thing that I really find interesting about Dungeons & Dragons design is that various classes get their subclass, their sort of archetypes at different times, which kind of represents what the archetype is. So as we'll go on to describe, 2 o'clock new or modified actions like Fighter's Action Surge or Rogue's Cunning Action, different ways to take actions. Rogues can dash as a bonus action rather than as an action. That's pretty class defining, disengage and stuff. And fighters can occasionally take 2 actions in a row. These are defining things, new or modified actions. And then 3 o'clock is usually when everybody gets their subclass, their archetype. But some traditions get it at 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock based on whether they would, basically. Sorcerers get their subclass at 1 o'clock because sorcerers have their magic innately. So they get it right away because they would. And the sorcerer subclasses are the origin of your innate magic. Like stuff like that. Or things like druid and cleric get their subclasses at 2 o'clock. The lore here evades me a little bit more, but it feels to me like it makes sense for them to get it earlier because that's where it all comes from. I mean, it's like they were an initiate for one level, and then they're a druid of that circle or a cleric of that church, monastery, order, tradition. They would have it sooner. That just feels sensible. There are classes that buck this trend, like paladins. I'm not really sure I understand how you are a paladin, but you haven't taken a certain oath. You're training to be a paladin. Paladins get it at 3rd level. At 3 o'clock, we're going to try. But you get the idea. There are, plenty of them. Warlocks get their subclass at 1 o'clock because it's the source of their power is their pact with their warlock patron. And yeah, you need to know who that is if you're going to be a warlock, so you get it right away. It wouldn't really make sense if you didn't. We will come back to this, but the fact that some classes get that, earlier is also, I think, a really, really big aspect of making a build in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, because it means that sometimes you get a lot more at specifically 1st level. It's pretty balanced if you have, every class as a single class character at 3rd level, but if you only get 1 level, there are some classes that kind of spike a little bit early, or a really key thing for multiclassing is that some of those 1st level, I'm doing it, 1 o'clock subclasses, some of those give you proficiencies, and when you multiclass, you don't get all the proficiencies always. This can allow you to quickly pick up, like heavy armor proficiency is the common one. You don't get heavy armor for multiclassing, but there are a few classes you can multiclass into that have a way at level 1 to give you heavy armor proficiency through their subclass. So that's a pretty big deal, and a good way to potentially get that, not really sooner, but in less time or in a very time efficient manner anyway, which is what we care about here. So to review, we've been talking about sort of the 1 to 5 o'clock schedule that most classes in D&D have. And between 1 and 3 o'clock, you basically get your kind of core stuff. A lot of classes get their subclass at level 3, third level, 3 o'clock. I think my confusion here is a really good example of how this is a problem. And at 2 o'clock, a lot of them get some kind of different way to act. I think Fighter's Action Surge and Rogue's Cunning Action are pretty good examples. Sorcerer's Font of Magic, too, is interesting. Being able to kind of convert spell slots into sorcery points and then into spell slots and later into meta magic. That's kind of similar, I think. And then 1 o'clock is often your identity or your flavor, or, even if you're not going to get your subclass at 3 o'clock, you're probably going to get like the magic that the subclass will modify at 1 o'clock, like that. So that's a little varied. It can matter, but pretty standard. You basically have the tools of the trade on the table by 3 o'clock. 4 o'clock for every class in D&D 5th edition is an ability score improvement or a feat. So you can increase your stats by a few points, or you can take a feat, which gives you like some special ability that kind of falls outside specific classes. You could become a chef and make snacks for the party. You could become a better orator and speak real good to inspire people. I don't know. You could learn proficiencies or skills. You could get better at some stuff. Pretty simple. And there are also some kind of hybrids. They're feats, but they give you 1 stat point. So they're kind of half an ability score increase, and they also give you a little bonus. Those feats are really good. I think of them as hybrids. Anyway, you get a lot of choice here as well, although it's very common to just take the ability score increase, since taking it early is a really, really powerful increase to your character's effectiveness. What often happens at 4 o'clock is that a character made by a player who is making an effort to make something powerful will probably have ended up with 17 in one of their stats. Now in D&D, you can generally only go to 20. So if you're at 17, then a hybrid and then an ability score increase will get you to 20, and you can't go higher. And if that's your like spell attack modifier, or your attack with dexterity with a melee weapon or something, that's how effective you are at hitting enemies. You remember what I said about mathing out how likely it is you'll hit stuff in 65% and all that? This 4 o'clock scheduling point is the time to get ahead, because if you take the stats, like the feat is tempting for some choice, but you're not going to get that much choice at higher levels on the clock, higher hours on the clock, later hours in the night. You're not going to get as much choice later, so save the feats for the most part, maybe a hybrid. And grab the ability score increase now so that you spend most of the character's career with that higher chance to hit. You're kind of jumping the curve and getting in early into that bus schedule. If you grab that 20 in your stat to hit with a spell or something, if you get that as soon as possible. Now, again, hybrids are a really, really good way to solve this. You can still get 1 stat point. You're at 17 out of 20 a lot of the time. 15 from your base ability scores, and then plus 2 from a relevant race. So you get 17 in like charisma as your casting stat, or your punching enemies, so strength, whatever it is. Whatever determines whether your spells or attacks hit. You get 17, so a hybrid that gives you 1 point will get you to 18, and in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, you only get plus 1 a modifier when you have 2 from your score above 10. And so if you're at 17, you have plus 3, just like if you had 16. And if you have 19, you'll have plus 4, just like if you had 18. So gaining 1 stat point is pretty much the same as 2 for a little while. And so taking a hybrid and then the feat to cap you out at 20 at level 8, at 8 o'clock, I can't do this, but I'm going to try my best, is often really efficient. And you still get to kind of pick something. Maybe you get a little dash of extra spell casting from a hybrid magic initiate feat, something like that. Anyway, it can be a really good option. So that's 4 o'clock. Usually an ability score improvement or like hybrid early on, and then you might take feats later. And for a lot of classes, this is going to happen every 4 hours or so down the schedule. Certainly at 8 o'clock for every class. There might be some that, well, fighters get more, and there are a few other classes that get more, right? Anyway, I don't have that memorized, but certainly at 8 o'clock, you're getting another ability score increase or feat opportunity. And finally, we've come to the suggested topic for this parlay, although I've been really interested in bringing up how each moment of this schedule can be really impactful in its own ways. It's often really tempting, as we'll go on about in a minute, to take 1 or 2 levels in a class with multiclassing, and then but 3rd level you'd get your subclass. But then 4th level you'd get the ability score increase, and that feeling is one of the pressures that I think makes building a character in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition so satisfying potentially. Anyway, at 5 o'clock you get a major power increase. You get extra attack if you're a martial class that gets that. Rogues don't, because that's not how they do their thing. They're more sneak attack, one big planned out hit. but a lot of them will get extra attacks, so they get to attack twice now instead of once with their action. And spellcasters also get third level spells, which are a pretty big jump from second level spells. First and second level spells are like petty utility, things like removing poison or a small quick heal, or you run a bit faster. They're not big combat changing things. Third level spells are a big jump. You have Fireball, which can one-shot an entire group of smaller enemies. You have spells that can hit in 100-foot line, like and potentially hit dozens of enemies in a hallway. Not dozens, but close to a dozen enemies in a hallway. Sure, that's a lot. That's a huge jump, and so you are getting this kind of big power increase. So as EyePatchNotes has gone on to say, the systemic expectation, as I've been explaining about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition's math, is that pure weapon-based classes will acquire extra attack on a 5 o'clock bus. They'll get it at 5 o'clock. However, select classes or archetypes can make additional attacks under some condition or restriction. Referring to the mentioned trend, that means a 3 o'clock character, I tried really hard there, has theoretical access to archetypes, modified actions, and extra attack, but under different names. So what EyePatchNotes is getting at is that there are some features of maybe your subclass that you might get at 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock that can in some ways mimic a power increase that the game's math assumes you're going to get at 5 o'clock, which skews the power level of those until, in the time between. And a lot of people play a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons they play between 1 o'clock and 5 o'clock. Those are common levels. People do generally start low. So for example, an example I know you're going to go on to give is that Rangers, for example, the Gloomstalker subclass, so you'd get this at 3 o'clock, and on the first turn of combat, you get an extra attack. You pretty much get extra attack. It also adds the extra attack. So at 5 o'clock, you're going to get 3 attacks, and by 3 o'clock, you already get 2 attacks. Now, only for the first turn of combat, but because you have such an enormous mathematical advantage, or what is called action economy, in the context of 3 o'clock, you basically get to take 2 turns on the first turn of combat. There's not going to be that many turns of combat if you can just take 2 turns on the first turn of a 3 o'clock fight with enemies appropriate for that level. They're just going to be dead, like they're in all likelihood. And so there is a way in which it is surprisingly similar. As a matter of fact, EyePatchNotes, you got somewhat lucky. I am right now, well, not right this second, currently playing a campaign where my girlfriend is playing a Gloomstalker Ranger, and it's scary sometimes. Like at 5th and 8th level as well, when dexterity got capped, which was 8 o'clock, and 5 o'clock when extra attack was online. I mean, she could make like 3 attacks that are basically guaranteed to hit right away, which a lot of enemies with Hunter's Mark and Favored Foe don't survive the equivalent of 4 or 5 attacks worth of damage once you add Hunter's Mark, and that's on the first turn of combat, and she often goes first because Gloomstalkers also have better initiative, so they often act first in combat. Usually there's something in that fight that just doesn't take a turn because it dies to getting shot full of arrows. It could be many other weapons could do this in a really scary way too. Yeah, really scary stuff. So this idea that you can kind of gain these features at a different time is pretty interesting. I'm going to give some of my own examples before I move on. So something that's fascinated me for a long time is in Dungeons & Dragons in 5th edition, when you get a critical strike, when you roll a 20 to hit on something with an attack roll, you double the damage, you double the direct damage, and like the dice and effects from the dice. So sometimes this can be really scary if you have something that happens or that you can add to any attack. So warlocks and Hexblade warlocks and and paladins have the ability to kind of burn a spell slot for extra damage. And you can choose to do this when you know an attack is a crit. So if you're a paladin and a warlock, but let's just forget about that for a sec, you can, wait for the crit and then invest the slot, and you're getting double out of it. So getting a lot of crits is extra valuable. And there are a few ways you can influence that. There are a few separate multipliers. Indulge me briefly. That let you do that more reliably. If you attack a lot of times, obviously that helps increase your chances. But if you're attacking, 3 or 4 times, what you really want to do is not squeeze out a 5th attack. I mean, you could, that's fine. But what would be ideal would be to get something that increases the range of critical, or the likelihood you'll get a crit. And there are a couple of ways you can do this. You can get advantage, which means you roll twice and take the higher roll. If either of them is a 20, then you get a crit. And you can also get a feature that increases the critical range. Fighters have a subclass that does this, and warlocks also have a subclass that does this. But the fighter one, you get that later. Warlocks get that at first level. You don't get it all the time. And I said first level again, but it's at 1 o'clock. And yeah, you can do a 1 level class dip into Warlock and spend only 1 hour getting the ability to make 19s and 20s into crits. And then if you get advantage, you roll twice and a 19 or 20 crits. And then if you attack like 3 times, the likelihood is rapidly increasing. And this is really scary. This is that Warlock thing is super common knowledge to the 5e community. But there are a lot of ways to sort of force multiply that effect, to do other things that, like, once you have that, it's not increasing the crit range to 19 or 20 that is so scary. What's so scary is that it's kind of like getting extra attacks at first level. You don't really get extra attacks, but the one effect of extra attacks, more crits, has been replicated immediately right when you start playing that character, which can be a lot. And you can be a 5th level, 5 o'clock, I'm never going to stop messing it up, and get extra attacks. And you're going to be able to spend 1 level and add, I can't do it, extra, chance to crit. So going on to the rest of the question, the real meat and potatoes here is that you can use multiclassing to do this. Now, I've talked a lot about my multiclassing addiction in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I make a lot of characters. I have sort of I've told people who've been watching the stream that I play my characters as members of a mythological pirate crew, and each of them is someone that either will join or is part of it and is being deployed for something, or has left, but this crew doesn't really work that way. They think they left, let's say it that way. And this means that I want to know who the members of the crew are so that I can think about when I play one, who do they know, who are their friends, how are they influenced? And it also helps, something I think is helpful for role-playing, which is thinking about what type of magic they've been exposed to, or that they're like really familiar with. They've seen a wizard cast fireball maybe, but did they like live with them for a year? You know what I mean? Or did they just see that once? These are people that my characters lived with for probably years, sometimes decades, or at least knew for a little while. And even if you were only on the ship for a few months, it's a ship. I mean, you basically shared a single room with them. Like, you know them pretty well is the point. It's not like you just know of artificers. Like, you basically know the class inside and out, because you worked with them, you lived with them, you basically slept with them for like 3 months. Anyway, the point is, this means that I've built out, a whole range of characters. And the kind of player I am, I really like to have a little of everything. I want to use every class. I want a variety as much as possible. I don't want to use one class over and over. And I found that even without manipulating circumstances, I actually didn't. I really didn't trend toward using any class. I used almost every class once. I missed one. And I didn't use any class more than twice. So and I made 9-10 characters or so, but they're all multi-classed. One of them isn't multi-classed, but I just, upon analysis, it just doesn't makes sense not to almost all of the time, especially the higher you get in levels. And we're going to talk about why. That might seem crazy to some people, probably not to others, but it is better to multiclass into something for essentially every character, even if it's only a one level dip, just because you can get so much from one level, and it can be kind of late. But it can also be really powerful with very specific combinations to multiclass early and gain access to something that you're not really, again, like supposed to have with the game's math until 5 o'clock. So let's talk about that. With multiclassing on the table, one of the first questions EyePatchNotes says is, what would a non-multiclass character be capable of? Right. What is the game expecting you're going to have? And multiclassing is interesting in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition because the game is designed around you being effective with a single class character. And if you delay access to stuff like extra attack without a plan for how you're going to make up for that, you're generally weaker. I really like that it's a game where if you don't want to go for that building option, you avoid it, and you're generally better off unless the person making the build has a really good idea. Synergy is really important, or it's just worse. You just get something worse. That's one thing I really love. EyePatchNotes goes on, this question can be mapped and addressed as above, and my translation would be, what could the character be capable of at earlier junctures? In a 5 o'clock context, a 3 o'clock ranger into 2 o'clock rogue has both the rogue's sneak attack and cunning action with the ranger's toolbox. This means that if they pick that Gloomstalker subclass I mentioned for ranger, they can still make 2 attacks on the first turn of combat, but they also have sneak attack damage, and they also have cunning action, so they're twice as fast, and they can do extra sneak attack damage, which is more than the equivalent of another attack at this level. And on the first turn of combat, they get 2 attacks. Probably not that hard to trigger sneak attack with those 2 attacks. So yeah, like they're significantly better off than if they were just the 5th level ranger in some ways. It's not that straightforward, but they have achieved something. They've accomplished something by multiclassing. They're not just delaying 5th level ranger, but they have more tools. They are, not in every way, but in a lot of ways, really more powerful than if they'd kept to the schedule. The player can then decide which ranger archetype suits their preferences. I picked Gloomstalker just now. But yeah, you could certainly pick something else, right? And to oversimplify, quite a few ranger archetypes fall into various camps, making a conditional extra attack only on their first turn, only on 2 separate targets, etc. Horizon Walker, Gloomstalker, Horizon Walker can do a thing where if they spread out their attacks, they get to make more attacks. So provided they don't focus one target, they can make kind of an extra attack that stacks with extra attack on someone else. It can't be on the same target. Or a lot of ranger archetypes give you extra damage, but only on a single attack, which can, for a little while, replicate extra attack. You could be 3rd level and you're getting only 1 attack because you multiclass for 2 levels in something else. But at 5 o'clock, you are attacking 1 time and getting, 1 attack and then bonus damage on that attack, which mostly makes up for the attack you didn't get by staying on the schedule and getting extra attack at 5 o'clock. That makes sense. Also, I suspect that EyePatchNotes really likes multiclassing into Rogue. Personally, I'm not the hugest fan, but it's like Rogue is a great class, of course, and Cunning Action is awesome. Both camps benefit from the Rogue's mobile and sneak attack identity in their own special way. While the character gives up true extra attack and deeper features of either class, the specific benefit of more damage is maintained. Right. And while you get deeper features from the classes, that's versatility you're gaining. And you did gain versatility by multiclassing. So the really important thing is to make sure that your overall damage output keeps pace. So if you can achieve a multiclassing combination that I think 5 o'clock is a really good timestamp that achieves that damage without getting extra attack, you're probably in good shape because you can, 1, likely get extra attack later, and 2, you probably traded the simplicity of extra attack for utility, which is what you would have gotten if you stayed on the schedule, got extra attack, and then continued. You would have gotten, more variety, more utility options from moving forward. Now, spellcasting classes do complicate this a little bit. They complicate this because of what we talked about before with spells like Fireball. At 5 o'clock, those spellcasting classes get 3rd level spells. Now, the thing about spellcasting with multiclassing is that if you multiclass with 2 full caster classes, let's say you do Wizard and Artificer, let's do that. You get the same spell slot progression, basically. You get 3rd level spell slots at 5 o'clock, just like you would have if you didn't multiclass. And you may have gained pretty powerful boons in the meanwhile. For example, you could play an Artificer Armorer and wear heavy armor with no strength, and wear a shield, and have 18 armor class, which is absurdly tanky even with just chainmail. And because you have 5 hours, you're at 5 o'clock, 3 o'clock took you to that armorer subclass as an artificer, and 2 more hours, the 5 o'clock, takes you to your wizard subclass. That's a lot. That is a lot. That is likely very powerful. You could be a blade singer and drop the shield and get really gross amounts of armor class or any number of crazy other things. That's all great, but, big but, while you have 3rd level spell slots, you don't have 3rd level spells, because the spells that you can learn, that you can know, that you can cast are determined by your levels in the individual classes that are teaching you those spells, even if you have spell slots that allow you to cast a higher level spell. Now, this isn't the end of the world, because you can upcast spells. You can be using a 2nd level spell that does decent damage. You don't have Fireball. May I recommend like Shatter, for example? It's not as good, but it's not a bad imitation if you upcast it to 3rd level. You have something. You didn't lose everything there. And that is a little equivalent to how we kind of jury-rigged extra attacks with martial classes. I think the issue is that where with the jury-rigged extra attack, we really didn't lose damage. You know, if the combat goes on or the conditions for the conditional extra attack are not met, yeah, maybe it will lead to losing damage. But likely in the early turns of combat or when those conditions are met, we'll make up for that damage and then some. So on balance, provided the conditions are met at some point, those martial classes really were not losing damage on balance. Whereas while you've gained some advantages, the kind of spellcaster multiclass, my Artificer Wizard from before, has lost something. Like, you do lose raw damage. There's really no doubt that in most cases you have lost raw damage output. So while you did gain a lot of versatility, the equation is a little bit different now. I do feel that it's important to note that the point on the schedule you're at does change the equation here still. So for example, like if you merely increase the schedule we're looking at to like 7 o'clock, then at a time when other classes might not be getting a particularly meaningful power spike, your Artificer Wizard character can continue on as an Artificer and gain access to 3rd level spells by going up to hour 7 o'clock, and they're now a 5-hour Artificer and a 2-hour Wizard. A 5 o'clock Artificer and a 2 o'clock Wizard. You can see how my brain is really struggling to manage all the verbiage. But again, I think that's a good example of how maybe this could have been worded more clearly by Wizards of the Coast when they designed the damn game. What are you going to do? And then that can, more than make up for it. If you can manage that 5 o'clock slot, you have maybe invested in a power spike that's going to come later. So while you might get access to that thing later, you're replicating your Fireball or whatever later, you're going to get there. And then if you had just gone straight for the Fireball, you would be in some ways worse off. You did accomplish something. I just think all these calculations are really interesting. If you're prone to analysis paralysis like me, it might take you like an entire day to come up with what you're going to do for a character, but I think it's really fun. And as EyePatchNotes concludes, it's almost most exciting to see 6 o'clock and beyond. Parking Ranger at 3 o'clock. Parking, okay. The next Ranger bus yields an ASI or a feat, an ability score increase. Parking Rogue at 2 o'clock. The next Rogue bus yields an archetype feature and sneak attack damage increase. Or the player can opt for a 3rd class and add another identity to their character profile. Personally, I don't allow more than one multi-class in my games, and my playgroup when other people DM, they don't either. Simply because I feel like it allows you to have everything. I just feel like it's the point at which choice begins to lose meaning, because you can just get everything, or you can make characters there are a lot of powerful characters that go 1 hour, first hour, and get their subclass. You could do sorcerer warlock, for example, and then grab something that gets one at hour 1 or hour 2, and suddenly you have a really crazy pile of class features at a really low level, and it kind of doesn't stop being a good choice. It just, the good choice becomes more similar after that first multi-class choice. The second one, if you allow it, starts to get closer and closer to you're going to be jumping for those for that Hexblade Warlock, for that, Tempest Cleric or something, to gain, good armor proficiencies and a lot of damage output, that, or like a fighter for a fighting style or something, are going to become things that you will more and more go to, because you will have gotten the things you wanted for your character's actual synergy, and then there will never stop being good multi-class options to just get gravy. And I'm not saying that means you multi-class forever, but for a lot of characters, it would make sense to multi-class like 2 or 3 times, basically every time, like in kind of to the same places. So personally, I think that once you multi-class more than once, it gets a lot less interesting. It certainly, maybe 1 more multi-class fine, but then once you have 4 total classes, that 4th class is often kind of a gimme, and also it is interesting to consider how a lot of the time multi-classing can be replicated by a feat or mimicked by a feat, but I think a lot of the time multi-classing is better, and that's kind of a lot of the problem for me, especially for martial characters. At higher levels, you get to like 11th level or so, 11 o'clock, as a barbarian or a fighter or something, and it rarely doesn't make sense to just multi-class a bunch of times to get all sorts of stuff, to grab Hexblade Warlock, to grab you probably don't need the armor proficiency at that point, but there are a lot of things you could get. Again, they're not coming to my mind right this instant, but there are loads of things you can just quickly pick up. Spellcasting, just a dash of utility spellcasting, some cantrips. I probably would have taken that earlier, but what are you going to do? So yeah, I mean, it is interesting how feats, like taking a feat, lets you keep that class progression, especially as a spellcaster. If you wanted something from multiclassing that you can get from a feat, you might get less stuff from taking the feat, but you get to keep progressing as that one class, which can be an interesting decision point. But overall, I personally think it's kind of a separate discussion, but I want to weigh in my on balance negative, but I don't want to overstate it, feelings about multiclassing like more than once. Maybe 3, I don't know. You try it if you disagree with me. But that's how I've mostly felt, is that the thing that made the choice interesting was that I only got to pick 1 more class. And I have to think about whether I want to choose a different class or stay as the one I am. But that's just me. I mean, again, I have reasons I feel that way, but you take it or leave it. And I agree, EyePatchNotes, that the decision trees that come up every time the player thinks about what class to take next are really interesting. Even with only 2 classes, you've multiclassed only once. This thing that I mentioned much earlier in the video comes up, where you're thinking every time you take a level, okay, I did my combo, my synergy for my character has been achieved. Like, I've got it. We're done. I have a character I've been really wanting to play that is a Soul Knife rogue, and Soul Knives can they get to add a psionic effect. They get to psychic to try to make a roll succeed when they do like an ability check or something. And the key thing is that if it doesn't make them succeed, they don't lose the feature. So they get a limited number of uses, but they only consume them if they succeed, which means you sort of get kind of a blanket increase to those checks, because you're not going to be consuming them. By trying a lot is not punishing, as long as you don't try trivial things, And then I picked a Fey Wanderer, which is a ranger subclass. I don't remember. It's a Ranger subclass. I'm going with Ranger. Final answer. It's a Ranger subclass. And Fey Wanderer lets you add your Wisdom score to your Wisdom modifier to your Charisma checks. You can see where this is going. If you build a lot of Charisma and Wisdom, this class can guarantee like a 30 plus roll at level like 6 on like every Charisma thing. So yeah, I mean, they have good damage too. As EyePatchNotes mentioned before, a lot of Ranger subclasses get a thing where they get like extra damage on one attack per turn. Fey Wanderer is one of those. So it synergizes nicely with Rogue's sneak attack because that works that way too. You get a big pile of damage if you can get the sneak attack conditions. And then Fey Wanderer also kicks in. So you still do good damage. There's still great damage. It's more like a Rogue's damage. But you have this monstrous charisma check that you can, this block of, raw ability check stats that you can just throw at social situations. This is like the most suave boy in all the Outlands. And I'm really looking forward to playing that character. But the thing that's going to happen, the real joy of the character, is that once you've achieved that, your 6th level, it's hour 6, it's 6 o'clock. Damn it. It's so tempting to pick both of them next. They both give you an ability score increase or a feat next because you're going to 4 o'clock in Rogue or Ranger. But then like at level 5, to the end, I wasn't able to learn. You start to get some crazy stuff. Like, do you want to dig into the extra attack thing? Because you'll get that at 5 o'clock Ranger. Or do you want to go more for, like, if you keep going Rogue, you're going to start getting a lot of defensive measures that will really add up. And you've got your medium armor from being a Ranger. There's a lot there. You maybe want to get Misty Step from, I think Fey Wanderer spells include Misty Step. Anyway, which is really good. You can just teleport. If you get those rogue, dodge and evasion features, and you have cunning action, and you have Misty Step, and you have all this sneak attack nonsense, and then in social situations, you just bowl people over with your sexy multiclass hat tip. I don't know, man, like it's pretty spicy. And it's appealing how both options feel worthwhile. Or, it would be a really strong temptation. Yeah, you go to 4 o'clock in one of them to get the ability score increase or the feat. And then you go to 4 o'clock in the other one to get the ability score increase or the feat. And at 8 o'clock, you've got the 2 ability score increases you would have gotten, but you really get them as this burst of efficacy that could feel really interesting. You can even, and this is really a separate topic that your DM may have feelings about, you could even fit the levels you take to the pace of the adventure, meaning there's a lot of downtime and you're using milestone leveling because you are a good guy, and it's fine if you use experience, but I do think milestone leveling is pretty much always better. And so, you come to a new town and you find a new thing about the magical MacGuffin, and you level up, and you're now, going into hour 6 or whatever, and you have a good reason to believe you're not going to be fighting a lot. So this is a good time to take a little dip in power, maybe delay that ability score increase, and gain some kind of social feature like this rogue ranger that I described is getting these monstrous charisma checks. Probably a good time to get that online. So grab it now and don't worry about the fact that you haven't gotten any ability score increase yet, and that your chance to hit is probably a little bit below average for this challenge rating. That's fine. Don't worry about it. Just keep going, and you'll succeed in these social situations. And then when you level up again and you're leaving, or you're close to being done, it's a good time to grab that ability score increase. Personally, I think this fits pretty well with role-playing. I think it is role-play-y to have to develop your abilities, or to begin making use of those abilities, or however you interpret leveling up and going more hours into that character. It could be a variety of things rather than just straight up learning the thing. However you interpret it, it's easy to imagine how your character would focus on that in the environment where they're using it more. I don't think that that's metagamey or a problem, but you should ask your DM. They probably won't, but they may not want you to try to min-max their campaign. They might be frustrated by it making things like relatively easier than it would make sense for it to be, because you are more levels of power than would be expected. You know, in other words, they'll balance the DC for, you know, influencing the innkeeper to have sex with you and give you information. They'll balance how good your charisma has to be to get that done based on what would be expected for your level. But because you've thought about when you're going to take those increases, your, you know, skill at that is going to be far higher than would be normally expected just at this specific level, and then it will balance out overall. They may not like that. I think that's cool. I think D&D kind of assumes you do pick levels based on what's happening. That's kind of a big storytelling thing, but I can imagine people not liking what I just said. So as usual, communicate with your DM. That's the only way Dungeons & Dragons is a fun game anyway. So please do it. Great. That was me hacking up the mental discord of trying to say the hours thing and then realizing every time I said level or whatever that it is a problem. It was good proof of concept for that. So there you go. I hope that my bumbling has been a good example of this thing you're suggesting. I think it is a good idea. As a brief closing comment, I personally think that the hour thing or the clock thing might make more sense for spells. So we were talking before about how your example is like a 3 o'clock wizard with access to second level spells. I kind of like a third level wizard with access to 2 o'clock spells. And the reason is that it kind of represents, like, to me, it's the spells that have the most dissonance with like when you're casting them. And there's that whole multi-classing thing about learning spells when you're at a level in that class. And to me, I think that makes that more clear. I get the value of the third level wizard thing versus 3 o'clock wizard. I get the value of the 3 o'clock wizard thing. But to me, it matches up with the game's verbiage better. And the overall, the thing that the game is not gonna, that's gonna be off balance is gonna be the game is saying third level wizard and you've retermed that, rather than like the game saying second level spells or whatever, and you've retermed that. That's not, I don't think that's as confusing. So I thought a thought I've been having throughout this parlay is maybe like 2 o'clock spells and third level wizard. I don't know. Thoughts, there are pros and cons. But yeah, I really love this topic, as you can hopefully tell. It really excites me. I think there's a lot to say about it. So I said a lot about it, and I hope you enjoyed what I had to say. Also, a special thank you to EyePatchNotes. This is one of the rare parlays that slip through the cracks. I have a vivid memory of answering this parlay. You can probably tell because I had extremely structured, specific examples that I didn't read from notes. I just had them because I swear to hell and back that I made this parlay, but I didn't. So I apologize. You had to wait way longer than was necessary. I could have sworn that I made this already, but I certainly enjoyed talking about it again.